Today, we're counting down 15 cults and ideological movements that contained a core idea so genuinely compelling, so rational on its surface, that thousands of intelligent people built their entire lives around it.
A new member would be blindfolded, told to take off her clothes, and lie on a massage table. 3 other women would then hold down her legs and shoulders, and she was told to say, "Master, please brand me. It would be an honor."
We're not here to mock them. We're here to understand exactly how the logic worked, because that logic is still out there, in different packaging, aimed at different people, possibly at you, right now, and you wouldn't know it yet. If you're new here, we do this every week. The stuff that sounds insane until it doesn't. Hit subscribe. Now, let's get into it. Number 15. The Oneida community, the cult that invented free love and also silverware. Before we get to the dark ones, and we will get there, we start with a cult whose ideas were so ahead of their time that mainstream society eventually adopted most of them, which should make you slightly uncomfortable about what that means. In 1848, a theologian named John Humphrey Noyes founded a commune in Oneida, New York, based on a radical proposition that conventional marriage was a form of ownership, that it produced jealousy and selfishness, and that a truly spiritually advanced community would practice what he called complex marriage, in which every adult member was considered married to every other adult member. Before you dismiss this as obvious exploitation, and there are legitimate criticisms we'll get to, here's what Oneida actually looked like from inside. Women had full veto power over any sexual advance. This was 1848. Women in New York State could not yet legally own property. Oneida women controlled their own bodies in a community where legally, outside its walls, they controlled almost nothing. They worked the same jobs as men. They cut their hair short. They wore practical clothing instead of corsets. They participated in community governance. The community prospered economically. They manufactured steel traps, then silk thread, then flatware. The Oneida silverware brand still exists. You may own some. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Noyes also invented a system called stirpiculture, selective breeding. He personally approved which community members could have children together, based on his assessment of their spiritual and physical fitness. He fathered at least 9 of the community's children himself. The women who bore them were selected by him. The man who built a community on women's liberation designed a system in which he personally controlled their reproduction. The ideas were real. The liberation was real. The control was also real. And the people inside couldn't see where one ended and the other began. That's the pattern we're going to keep seeing. Number 14. Ayn Rand's Inner Circle. The cult that called itself a philosophy. Ayn Rand never called it a cult. She called it objectivism. Her followers called themselves students of a rational philosophy. And on paper, the ideas weren't insane. Reason over faith, individual achievement over collective conformity, the right to pursue your own life without apology. A lot of people read that and nod. The ideas have genuine appeal. That's the point. What happened around those ideas is something cult researchers now study as a textbook case of ideological capture without religious framing. Rand's Inner Circle, centered on a group called the Nathaniel Branden Institute in New York in the 1960s, functioned by a set of unspoken rules that were never written down, but absolutely enforced. You did not criticize Rand's conclusions. You did not prefer a piece of music she had declared irrational. You did not maintain friendships with people she had declared morally compromised. If you did these things, and it got back to her, and it always got back, you faced tribunal discussions in which your deviation was examined, and you were expected to account for it. People lost decade-long friendships overnight when Rand declared someone a 0, her term for a person of no moral worth. Former members described the moment of expulsion as psychologically catastrophic, not because Rand had any legal power over them, but because she had become their entire reality. Every relationship they had ran through her approval. Here's the open loop from the start of this entry. What did Rand's philosophy actually produce in the people who lived inside it? A movement built on radical individualism produced people who couldn't form an opinion without checking it against one woman's judgment first. The philosophy ate itself, and the people who noticed were the ones she expelled. Number 13, Synanon, the drug rehab that became a totalitarian state. Here is a question with a genuinely good answer that led somewhere catastrophic. How do you actually fix addiction? Not manage it. Fix it. What would a community look like that took addiction seriously enough to restructure every aspect of life around recovery? In 1958, a man named Charles Dederick, a recovering alcoholic in Santa Monica, started trying to answer that question. He founded Synanon as a residential community where addicts lived together, worked together, and held each other radically accountable through a confrontational group therapy method called the game. The game worked like this. Participants sat in a circle and were allowed, encouraged, to say absolutely anything to each other. No accusation was off limits, no insult, no challenge. The idea was that by stripping away social politeness, people would be forced to confront the self-deception at the root of their addiction. And it worked. Early Synanon had genuine recovery rates that mainstream medicine couldn't match. Heroin addicts who had failed every other program stayed clean inside Synanon. The state of California held it up as a model. Celebrities donated. Journalists wrote admiringly. Here's what was happening underneath. Dederick gradually expanded the game's confrontational logic from therapy sessions into total life management. Members were told who to partner with, then told to swap partners. Couples who had been together for years were ordered to separate and pair with someone Dederick chose. Vasectomies were mandated for male members. Pregnant women were pressured toward termination. By the late 1970s, Synanon had a paramilitary wing called the Imperial Marines. In 1978, a rattlesnake was placed in the mailbox of a lawyer who had won a case against them. The snake had its rattle removed, so there would be no warning. The man who started a drug rehab ended up leading something that put a rattlesnake in a lawyer's mailbox. The original question was good. The answer, at the beginning, was working. That's what made every subsequent step easier to rationalize from inside. Number 12, Heaven's Gate, the cult with the most internally consistent cosmology. Here is the part of the Heaven's Gate story that almost never gets told. Everyone knows about the Nike sneakers and the purple shrouds and the 39 people who died in a San Diego mansion in 1997. That's the image. That's what gets used. What doesn't get discussed is that Heaven's Gate had one of the most internally coherent belief systems ever constructed by a fringe movement. Not coherent by external standards, coherent on its own terms. Meaning, if you accepted the starting premises, almost everything that followed was logical. Marshall Applewhite, taught that human bodies were temporary containers, that the soul was a separate entity at a higher level of existence, that Earth was a garden maintained by beings from the next level, who periodically sent emissaries, Jesus being one of them, being another, to offer humans a chance to graduate to the next level by transcending physical attachment. None of that is categorically different from mainstream religious claims about souls, divine emissaries, and transcendence. The difference is the specificity. Heaven's Gate gave you a complete operating manual, a detailed cosmology with consistent internal rules, an answer to every question that fit the framework. Members were highly educated. Several had science backgrounds. They built the group's website themselves. It still exists, maintained by 2 surviving members who chose not to travel with the group in 1997. They were not people who stopped thinking. They were people who found a framework that felt, from inside, like it answered everything. Here's the reframe. The most dangerous belief system isn't the one that sounds obviously wrong. It's the one that sounds like it might be right, that gives you more explanatory power than anything else you've encountered, that makes you feel, for the first time, like the universe makes sense. That feeling is the trap, and it's not unique to Heaven's Gate. Number 11. The Sullivanians, the therapy cult that banned love. This one starts with a question that genuine psychologists still debate. Is romantic love, as most people experience it, actually good for you? The research on this is less settled than you'd expect. Attachment anxiety, possessiveness, the way intense romantic pair bonding can shrink a person's world, eliminate outside friendships, create psychological dependency. These are real documented phenomena. Legitimate therapists write about them. In the 1970s on Manhattan's Upper West Side, a group of therapists built an entire community around the answer. No, romantic love, as conventionally practiced, was neurotic. It was a form of psychological damage rooted in a destructive nuclear family structure. The cure was community, open relationships, the elimination of exclusive attachment. The Sullivan Institute for Research in Psychoanalysis, led by Saul Newton and Jane Pierce, attracted artists, academics, and intellectuals. At its peak, it had hundreds of members living in adjacent Upper West Side apartments, sharing childcare, rotating partners, attending multiple therapy sessions per week. The children were the tell. Members were discouraged from spending more than a few hours per week with their own children. Exclusive parental attachment was, by the Institute's framework, exactly the kind of neurotic bonding that created damaged adults. Children were raised collectively. Some later described not knowing which adults were their parents. Several described feeling essentially parentless. The therapists treating members for attachment damage were creating it in the next generation, on purpose, as a feature of the system. The people inside were in therapy, multiple sessions per week, with therapists who were members of the same community, whose income depended on those members staying, and who had a theoretical framework explaining why any desire to leave was itself a symptom of the very damage being treated. The therapy made leaving feel like proof you needed more therapy. That's not a bug. That's architecture. Number 10. Nexium, the personal development program with a branding iron. We need to talk about what Nexium actually sold before we talk about what it was. It sold a curriculum, 12-day intensive courses called Executive Success Programs, built around a self-developed philosophy called Rational Inquiry. The pitch was specific and corporate. You have limiting beliefs that are holding you back from peak performance. This program identifies and dismantles them. Executives paid thousands of dollars. Celebrities attended. The curriculum had a ranking system, colored sashes like martial arts belts, which created a ladder of achievement that kept people engaged and spending. The material borrowed from legitimate psychology, from Stoic philosophy, from organizational behavior research. People reported genuine breakthroughs in the early levels. That's documented. Former members who later became prosecution witnesses described real value in the early courses, real changes in how they managed anxiety, conflict, and decision-making. That's what made the next levels possible, because NXIVM's structure was a funnel. The early courses worked well enough to create trust. The trust created access. The access created a filtering process that identified the most committed, most malleable, most isolated members. Those people were invited deeper. Each level required more secrecy, more sacrifice, more proof of commitment. The inner circle, DOS, a secret sorority, required members to provide collateral before being told what they were joining. Damaging personal information, compromising photographs, signed false confessions, material that could destroy them if released. They provided it before knowing what it was for. The branding happened after, a cauterizing pen, the leader's initials, below the hip, while other members held them down and told them to breathe. Keith Raniere is currently serving 120 years in federal prison. The curriculum at the beginning was real. The techniques for making people unable to leave were built on top of it, so carefully that people couldn't see the foundation changing underneath them. Number 9, the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments, the cult with a perfect alibi. Here is a cult that operated in plain sight for a decade and was praised for it because what it looked like from the outside was indistinguishable from devout Catholic practice. Founded in Uganda in the late 1980s by Joseph Kibwetera and a former prostitute-turned-visionary named Credonia Mwerinda, the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God taught that the Virgin Mary had appeared to the founders with a message. The world was ending soon, and only those who strictly observed the Ten Commandments would be saved. Members gave their possessions to the movement. They stopped speaking. Silence was required to avoid the sin of lying. They fasted severely. They lived communally, worked communally, and prayed communally, with an intensity that local Catholic authorities initially viewed as admirable if excessive devotion. In March 2000, the group held a celebration. Members who had left were invited back. Hundreds of people gathered at the church compound in Kanungu. The doors were locked from the outside. The building was set on fire. Over 500 people died. Subsequent investigation found mass graves at multiple movement properties. People who had died months or years earlier, many with signs of strangulation. The leadership disappeared. Credonia Muerinda has never been found. Here is the part that haunts investigators. The silence requirement, which looked like extreme piety, meant members couldn't warn each other, couldn't compare notes, couldn't collectively notice that people were disappearing. The behavior that made the cult look most genuinely devout was the behavior that made it most dangerous. The alibi was the mechanism. The holiness was the trap. Number 8. EST/Landmark Forum, the cult that graduated into respectability. Est Erhard Seminars Training, launched in 1971 and became one of the most controversial and also most mainstream personal development phenomena in American history, which is itself worth examining. Werner Erhard's pitch was philosophical and confrontational. You are not your circumstances. You are not your history. You are not your feelings about your feelings. You are responsible, fully, completely, without exception, for every aspect of your experience. The training was designed to force this realization through 60-hour weekend sessions during which participants could not leave the room without permission, could not use the bathroom on their own schedule, were publicly confronted by trainers, and were systematically broken down before being rebuilt around the new framework. People left those weekends reporting profound transformation. Many described it as the most significant experience of their lives. The alumni list includes executives, therapists, celebrities, and ordinary people who credit Est with saving their marriages, their careers, their sense of purpose. Here's the open loop. If it worked so well, why does it appear on this list? Because the methodology used to produce those breakthroughs is, when examined carefully, a compression of exactly the techniques used in high-control groups to eliminate critical thinking and install new belief systems. Sleep deprivation, bathroom control, public humiliation, social pressure, identity dissolution, followed by guided reconstruction. The content installed was generally benign. Take responsibility, stop blaming, engage with your life. But the installation method was indistinguishable from coercive persuasion. Landmark Forum, the successor organization, still operates today. Millions of people have completed it. Most report positive outcomes. The debate among cult researchers isn't whether the content is harmful. It's whether you can ethically use those methods to install any content, even good content, without the subject's fully informed consent. That question doesn't have a clean answer. That's why it's at number 8. If you're still here, hit the like button right now. Genuinely helps. And don't go anywhere. The top 7 is where it gets really hard to dismiss. Number 7. The Order of the Solar Temple. The cult that convinced itself it was saving the world. The Solar Temple attracted exactly the kind of people who were supposed to be immune to cults. Doctors, judges, police officers, a mayor, successful business people across Switzerland, France, and Quebec. The membership read like an invitation list for a very good dinner party, and what they believed had a certain grandeur to it that's hard to dismiss as obviously delusional. The Order of the Solar Temple taught that it was the continuation of the Knights Templar, a real medieval order with a real history of genuine mystical syncretism. Its founders, Luc Jouret and Joseph de Mombro, blended Rosicrucian philosophy, Masonic ritual, and New Age cosmology into a system that told members they were custodians of ancient wisdom, guardians of a spiritual tradition that predated Christianity, initiates in something that mattered on a cosmic scale. The ritual was elaborate and beautiful. The community was wealthy and educated. The conversations were, by all accounts, genuinely interesting. In 1994, 53 people died across Switzerland and Quebec in coordinated fires and apparent group self-administrations. 18 more died in a second wave in 1995. 5 more in 1997. The letters they left behind are what make this entry number 7 on this list, because they didn't read like the writing of people who felt trapped or deceived. They read like people who were entirely convinced they were making a meaningful choice, that they were transitioning to a higher plane, that their deaths would send a message to a world that wasn't listening, that they were the ones who understood something everyone else had missed. The most dangerous thing about the Solar Temple isn't what Di Mambro told them. It's that they were exactly the kind of people who should have known better, and they didn't, because should have known better is not a defense against a belief system that makes you feel, for the first time, like you're finally part of something real. The intelligence didn't protect them. In some ways, it helped the trap work. Number 6. Rajneeshis, the cult that built a city and then poisoned a town. Here is a fact that still seems impossible. In 1984, in a small town in Oregon, a religious movement deliberately contaminated 10 restaurant salad bars with salmonella bacteria, sickening 751 people in an attempt to influence a local election by incapacitating voters. It was the first major bioterrorism attack in American history. It happened in the Dalles, Oregon, population 10,000. And it was carried out by followers of an Indian mystic who taught radical personal freedom, the sacredness of sexuality, the bankruptcy of all ideology, and the liberation of the individual from every form of social conditioning. The contradiction is not an accident, it's the point. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later Osho, was a genuinely compelling thinker. His critiques of organized religion, of political ideology, of the suppression of human instinct and joy were sharp enough that they attracted 200,000 followers worldwide, and a commune in Oregon that at its peak housed 7,000 people, had its own airport, its own police force, its own public transport system, and its own legal team. The Rajneeshis didn't look like a cult from inside. They looked like the most free people on earth. What was happening in the inner circle was different. Rajneesh's personal secretary, Ma Anand Sheila, ran the organization with methods that included wiretapping, murder plots, a bioterrorism lab, and the attempted assassination of Rajneesh's personal physician. Rajneesh later claimed he knew nothing. The courts were unconvinced about some of it. The salad bar attack was designed to swing a county election by keeping locals too ill to vote, ensuring Rajneeshi candidates would win seats that controlled land use, which would allow the commune to expand. They poisoned 751 people for a zoning dispute. The liberation philosophy was real. The liberation was not. Number 5. The Family/Children of God. The cult that rewrote the Bible and got away with it. David Berg had a genuinely effective evangelical method. In the late 1960s, he was reaching runaway teens and young people in California with a message that was, for its moment, exactly right. The church has failed you, institutions have failed you, but God's love is radical and unconditional and available right now, without rules, without judgment, for exactly who you are. That message worked. The movement grew fast, thousands of members across dozens of countries within a few years. Berg called himself Moses David. His letters, the Mo letters, became scripture. Then the letters started changing. Berg developed a theology he called the law of love, the idea that love, as God's highest law, superseded all other moral constraints. If love motivated an action, the action was holy. The logic was airtight within the system, and it was used to justify, over decades, a range of practices including the use of young women members to recruit men, a practice called flirty fishing, and the sexual abuse of children within the community, which Berg framed as expressions of love and spiritual freedom. What makes Children of God number 5 on this list is the document trail. Berg wrote everything down, thousands of pages. The theology that justified what happened is laid out, step by step, in his own hand, each step following logically from the previous one, each conclusion presented as a natural extension of love and freedom. You can read how it was done. You can see exactly where the logic turned. And the turn is so gradual, so carefully constructed, that identifying the single sentence where it crossed the line is genuinely difficult even in retrospect. That's not an accident. That's craft. Number 4, People's Temple, the cult that started as a civil rights organization. Before Jonestown, before the 918 deaths, before the phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered the language as casual shorthand, before all of that, there was something that was not obviously wrong. Jim Jones founded People's Temple in Indiana in the 1950s as an integrated church at a time when integrated churches were rare and frequently dangerous. He healed the sick. The healings were staged, but the integration was real. He built social programs, drug rehabilitation, care for the elderly, foster placements for children that the state couldn't place elsewhere. People's Temple moved to California in the 1960s and became a political force in San Francisco. Mayor George Moscone appointed Jones to the city's Housing Commission. Rosalind Carter met with him personally. Walter Mondale sent a letter of praise. The temple was doing visible, documented good work in communities that needed it, and Jones was positioning himself as one of the most effective, progressive religious figures in America. Here is the question that matters. At what point should the people who praised him have known? The answer is uncomfortable, because the abuses, the beatings, the public humiliations called catharsis sessions, the financial control, the sleep deprivation, were documented in an investigative piece published in New West magazine in 1977, before Jonestown, before the deaths. There was a record, but Jones had built enough political capital, enough goodwill, enough genuine credibility from the real work, that the warnings were absorbed and dismissed. Jonestown was not a sudden break. It was the conclusion of a process that had been visible at every stage to people who had reasons not to look directly at it. 918 people died in Guyana on November 18, 1978. The most important thing about People's Temple is not what it became. It's that what it became was built on something real, and the real thing made the rest of it possible. Number 3, the Venus Project/Zeitgeist movement, the cult with no leader and no name for itself. This entry is different from everything else on this list, and that difference is the point. The Zeitgeist movement had no membership fees, no compound, no single charismatic leader with unchecked authority, no religious framework. It described itself explicitly as not a movement in any traditional sense. What it had was a documentary, Zeitgeist, Addendum, released in 2008, that presented a coherent critique of monetary systems, institutional corruption, and resource scarcity, paired with a vision of a future society based on rational resource management and technology. The Venus Project, designed by futurist Jacques Fresco, provided the visual architecture, gleaming circular cities, post-scarcity economics, the elimination of money, and the political systems that served it. The ideas weren't insane. Monetary system critiques have serious academic literature behind them. The Venus Project's architectural visions were genuinely interesting. The documentary's critique of institutional corruption was, in many specifics, accurate. Here's what happened to the community that formed around it. Without a formal leadership structure, the movement self-organized around the most persuasive voices in its online spaces. Those voices competed for authority by demonstrating the highest level of ideological purity, who had gone furthest in rejecting the existing system, who was most committed to the vision, who could most thoroughly identify contamination of the movement's ideas by outside thinking. Members who asked critical questions were identified as not yet sufficiently awake. Former members describe a dynamic in which disagreement was treated as evidence of the questioner's incomplete understanding, which could only be remedied by more engagement with the movement's material. No leader, no compound, no ritual. And yet former members describe the exit experience, the social rejection, the identity loss, the disorientation, in language identical to people leaving high-control religious groups. The cult dynamics emerged from the community without anyone designing them, which means those dynamics don't require a manipulative leader to appear. they can grow themselves, from ideas that are mostly right, in communities that mean well. That's what makes this number 3. Number 2, Aum Shinrikyo, the cult that recruited scientists. On March 20th, 1995, members of Aum Shinrikyo released sarin gas on 5 lines of the Tokyo subway system during rush hour. 13 people died. Thousands were injured. It remains one of the most sophisticated terrorist attacks ever carried out by a non-state group. Aum Shinrikyo had chemists, physicists, engineers, medical doctors, graduates of Japan's most elite universities. The people who manufactured sarin in Aum's laboratories had the academic credentials to work anywhere. They chose this. Shoko Asahara founded Aum in 1984 as a yoga class. He was charismatic, partially blind, and had a syncretic spiritual vision that blended Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christian apocalypticism into a framework that predicted an imminent world war from which only Aum members would survive. The recruitment pitch for educated members was specifically intellectual. Asahara engaged seriously with science. He didn't dismiss it, he incorporated it. His teachings on consciousness, on the nature of reality, on meditation's effects on the brain, engaged with concepts from quantum physics and neuroscience in ways that felt sophisticated to people trained in those fields. Former members who had PhDs describe being genuinely intellectually engaged by Asahara's framework, not fooled by it, engaged. The ideas felt like they were wrestling seriously with real questions. The meditation practices worked. Members reported genuine experiences during intensive practice that seemed to validate the framework from the inside. Here is the reframe. The same intellectual sophistication that made Aum scientists good at their jobs made them better at rationalizing what they were doing. The skills that produce a good chemist, systematic thinking, trust in the framework you've been trained in, willingness to follow a line of reasoning wherever it leads. These are the same skills that, inside a high control group, produce someone who can manufacture a nerve agent and release it on a subway platform. Critical thinking is not a universal protection. It can be recruited, it can be turned, it can serve any conclusion if the framework it operates within has been sufficiently captured. That's the most frightening thing on this entire list. Number 1, early Christianity as documented by Rome, the original template. This entry is going to make some people uncomfortable. It is presented as history, not theology. What you do with the distinction is your own business. From the perspective of Roman authorities in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the early Christian movement displayed every characteristic that we now use to identify high-control groups. It demanded total loyalty to the group, to its leaders' teachings, to a framework that explicitly superseded family loyalty, civic duty, and the authority of the state. It promised exclusive salvation. Only members would survive the coming judgment. It required public declaration of belief. It practiced communal living and communal property in its early forms. It described outsiders in terms that created clear in-group/out-group boundaries. It spread through personal relationship networks rather than public advertising. Roman writers documenting early Christianity, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Celsus, described it using language that maps almost perfectly onto what modern cult analysts write about high-control movements: secret meetings, unusual rituals, excessive devotion to a recently executed leader whose followers claimed had returned from death, members who chose their group over their families. Here is the reframe that is not an argument against Christianity, but is the most important point on this list. Every major world religion looked from outside at an early stage like the movements we now call cults. The difference between a cult and a religion is, in most sociological definitions, time and numbers. A movement that survives long enough and grows large enough is called a religion. One that doesn't is called a cult. This is not a comfortable observation. It is not meant to be. What it means for the rest of this list is everything. Because if the difference is time and numbers, not truth, not ethics, not the quality of the ideas, then the question isn't which movements are cults and which are religions. The question is which of the ideas you currently hold, in the community you currently belong to, would look from the outside to a Roman administrator, to a future historian, to someone who doesn't share your premises, exactly like what we've been describing for the last 20 minutes. That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's a genuine question. The movements that trapped the smartest people on this list all had one thing in common. The people inside them were certain they were different, that they had found the real thing, that the framework made sense in a way other frameworks didn't. They were not stupid. They were not broken. They were certain. And certainty, it turns out, is not the same as correct. If this made you think, drop a comment. Subscribe if you want more of this. And I'll see you next week.